2018 was a terrible year at the University of Bristol. We were at the middle of a crisis in student mental health, a crisis which was impacting upon the whole community. But it wasn't just Bristol. Other universities were also experiencing a tsunami of mental health problems in the students. This wasn't even a new problem. You know, looking back in my early career, about 40 years ago, I had published a paper on the stress of moving to university back in 1987. But the difference was that this time round, the students were being hampered, they were being distressed, dismayed, to the extent that they couldn't engage in their studies anymore. And the data backed this tsunami up. The exponential rise in mental health problems in the student population had risen 7-fold in 10 years up to 22. So I had to do something. So I looked around and I discovered that a former student of mine, who I taught at Harvard, Laurie Santos, had now reached this amazing position as president of a residential college at Yale. So she was looking after students in her pastoral role. And she too was encountering this terrible problem with her students and decided to do something about it. So she put this course on called Psychology and the Good Life. And it was a phenomenal success. The most popular course ever at Yale. So I obviously contacted Laurie and said, hey, Laurie, we've got a real problem going on as well. And Laurie, in her typical gracious, generous way, shared her notes with me. And then we started working together. And I put on my version, a little bit more pithy, The Science of Happiness. And I ran it as a pilot just to see if anyone would turn up. 600 people turned up. So I knew I was onto something. And the university then gave me the green light to create a new course that was credit-bearing for first-year students that combined lectures on positive psychology, neuroscience, my own interest in child development, a little bit of philosophy. And what made this course very different is it combined lectures with practical activities. But what made it unique is that this course awarded credit on the basis of engagement alone. There were no graded examinations. So the students thought, this is going to be such an easy breeze. More fool them. Not only did they have to come to all the live lectures, they were not allowed to use computers, and we banned smartphones during the lecture. Because you see, I argued, look, you need to be engaging, and you cannot be engaging with me as a lecturer if you're looking at your phone. So I had them. They couldn't have their phones. They had to turn up every week to small group meetings of about 8 students, which were mentored by senior students who we had taught, to engage in activities, to review the content, to discuss and talk about these problems. They had to undertake the various activities, the evidence-based practices that we were talking about, and they had to write about them in their diaries and their journals every week. And we monitored these. We also got them to do a group project where they had to get on with each other for the first time, thrown in at the deep end. And then we invited them to also undertake their own assessments by undertaking various questionnaires on mental health, from happiness and loneliness and anxiety before the course, and then we followed them up afterwards to see if there had been any effect. We have now been running the course for 6 years, and we find the same pattern over and over again. And this is an amazing goldmine of data, of course. We're producing a whole multitude of papers. These are just some. And what we find is that there's a 10 to 15% every year increase in happiness, well-being, if you want to call it, depending on which measure you're talking about. So it works. Now, you might think 10 to 15% doesn't sound really transformative to me, but who wouldn't want to be 10 to 15% happier or healthier or wealthier? And that's the average course. For some students, it was life-transforming. That's the good news. The bad news is this paper here that I'm sure some of you are thinking about. Does this really last? Well, it's good and bad news. The bad news is about 6 months after the courses are finished, the students go back down to their baseline measures again. But in those students who were half the population we sampled, who kept up with the activities, they maintained their levels of happiness up to 2 years later and went on to graduate. So, I haven't got the luxury of 10 to 12 weeks to take you through the entire course, but of course, I want to just point out that you just suddenly can't become happy. This lecture tonight will not be changing your lives. If you want to be a happier person, you have to put in the effort. There's no point going to a lecture for 10 weeks and then not doing anything afterwards. It's like going to the gym. In my mind, mental health is the same as physical health. There's no point walking in and trying to pick up a heavy weight. You'll give yourself a hernia. Much better to practice over long term, just building up your strength. In the same way you build up your physical strength, you can build up your mental strength. So, as I said, I don't have the 10 weeks, but of course I have a book to promote. The Science of Happiness. Now, look, why do we need another book on happiness? There are thousands of books on happiness. I'm sure many of you know some. Many celebrity books on happiness. Everyone has an opinion on happiness. What could I possibly be offering? Well, first, everything I say is evidence-based, so it's all based on research. Okay, maybe that's not too surprising. But I think I've got a unifying account for why happiness is so difficult and elusive, and why I think many positive psychology interventions work. And I'm going to give you the punchline now. They work because they change the way we think about ourselves, our self. I'm going to argue that in order to become a happier person, we have to review the way we think about ourselves in relation to our problems, in relation to others, in relation to the environment. That's the secret to becoming a happier person. Now, of course, this is the Royal Institution, and of course, any opportunity to speak in this auspicious hall invites you to try demonstrations. And so, of course, don't shy, I'll be asking you at various points to take part in some of my demonstrations, if only to illustrate the point. So pay attention. I'm hoping to keep you entertained for the next hour. Okay. But first, some ground rules. Someone asked me in the reception just a moment ago, what is happiness? Well, it depends on who you speak to. Happiness means different things, but in my mind, there are two components to it which are worth noting. First, there's the emotional component, the feelings, the moods of positive joy, elation. But there's also a sense of happiness which is more cognitive. How am I getting on in life? Am I progressing? Is my life worthwhile? Am I using it? Am I content? So I think there's an emotional component to happiness as well as this more cognitive component. Okay, so why does it seem to dissipate? Why do our students seem to kind of go back down to baseline? Well, for one very obvious reason, in order to experience happiness, you've got to know what it's like to be unhappy. Because if you were constantly happy, you wouldn't notice the difference. Our brains only really ever detect differences. Okay, so what about these students who got this extra boost of 15%? Does that mean they're eternally happy? No. They also have moments of unhappiness, but the difference is that when they encounter moments of unhappiness, they recover much more quickly. So in many ways, I really should have called the book about how not to be unhappy. But there's another interesting reason why happiness appears to be elusive. And it comes down to the fact that happiness is an emotion, and emotions and motivation have their same origin in the Latin from movere, to mean to move. So they're drives. And drives by their nature must satiate. We have hunger drives, sex drives. You must get used to them in order to compel you to do them again. So happiness is something that we're pursuing, we're working towards, and we can never achieve it because we need to maintain this drive to keep acting towards it. Indeed, Aristotle called it the pleasure principle, because every decision you make to some extent is premised on the assumption that you're going to be happier afterwards or avoiding something which is unpleasant. But then this gets to a problem. Because if you get used to things, then you have this issue of adaptation. And this leads to the so-called hedonic treadmill. Now, if I was to go out in the street or ask my students, what do you think would make you happy? You know what they say, and I guess many of you would say, money. I'd like a large sum of money. Now, don't get me wrong. Contrary to popular opinion, money can buy you happiness. It can. Absolutely it can. It just depends on how much you have and where you are and what your disposition is and what your starting point is. But what I also know is that you can never have too much money. Or, in other words, enough is never enough. Because once you've enjoyed the benefits and the utility of some money, you want more money. And so you work harder and you're pursued and you're compelled to keep going after this because it's a drive. And this leads to the hedonic treadmill. And it means that you keep moving forward, you keep chasing it, but you never seem to get there. Okay, so this is our opportunity to try a demonstration. I can't induce emotional adaptation in you, but what I'm going to do is sensory adaptation, because the adaptation is a feature of the central nervous system. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask you to look at the center of the screen, and hopefully no one has a tendency for epilepsy, but look at the center, because I'm going to rotate it, and I want you to stare at the center of the screen, because I'm going to talk to you what I'm doing at this point. What I'm doing is I'm fatiguing or adapting a set of cells in the back of your brain, the visual cortex, which are selectively tuned to rotational motion in the clockwise direction. And as you're looking to it, your brain is adapting. Now, the way that we perceive the world is combining all the information from all the relevant sensors, so that if you fatigue one set of sensors, you experience a distortion. So now look at the back of your hand. Ooh, it should be writhing. If you've been fatiguing, hands up if you can see it writhing. Yes, many of you have. Others weren't really focusing. That writhing is the consequence, okay? It's the same, it's a motor after effect. It's the same as when you're sitting on a bus or a train and you're driving along and you come to a halt and suddenly the world seems to be moving in the opposite direction. That's a demonstration of adaptation. But the other reason I wanted to show you that is it's a good example about how our conscious awareness or perceptions or experiences are determined by the brain, and the brain has design features that can be manipulated or biased. So this is a recurrent theme I'll be talking about tonight, that our happiness, or lack of, is somewhat dependent on our brain. Now, this is not a new idea. The Stoic philosophers, Epictetus, said, men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of things. In other words, it's not what happens to you, it's how you respond that matters. Two people could face exactly the same adversity. One will be absolutely decimated by it. The other person will draw a line under it and move on. Why is that? Why do some of us seem to see the glass half empty and others see it half full? Well, again, it's a complex answer. But part of it comes down to our biology, our dispositions, what we get from our parents. So we know from the field of behavioral genetics, where you look at the relationship between some personality aspect and identical twins versus non-identical twins, you can estimate what the variation is down to the genes. And to give you the bottom line, happiness is about the same as intelligence, around about 50% in terms of heritability. What does that mean? Well, that means that some of us are very much like our parents, and some of us are very unlike our parents, but on average, overall, the relationship is only 50%, which means that there's a lot of room for life events, experiences, education, and what we discover. And this is where positive psychology can make a difference, by changing the way that you think about things. The problem with that, of course, is this thing, okay? This 3-pound lump of tissue that's evolved, because it has a design feature which means that you pay more attention to things which are going badly in your life. Why would you have this negativity bias to focus on threats or problems? Well, strategically, it's much better to pay attention and respond to potential threats than it is to notice the status quo or pay attention to good things. If you can react to threats, then this protects you and keeps you in the gene pool. Not only do we focus more on the criticism. As a writer, I tell you, when you get a negative review on Amazon, it's much worse. All the positive reviews make no difference. Anyone will tell you that a criticism stings. And this just reflects this bias. But we're also wired to respond automatically in a way which reveals this bias. For example, how many of you have driven along and someone's cut you off and you suddenly thought and you swore and you gesticulated and you honked your horn? Is it just me? Yeah, okay. Thank God for that. That's an example of road rage. Okay, road rage is a good example of the fight or flight response. You see, our body is wired to respond to potential threats with a whole set of physiological responses, the release of cortisol, the stress hormone, and adrenaline, and glucose floods into the body, and your heart rate increases, and breathing, and it's all to mobilize you for action, the so-called fight or flight. But it's also highly triggered to negative emotions, rage, anger, fear, panic. These are automatic events. Now, in the past, from an evolutionary point of view, these would generally be good responses, but today's society seems to present so many triggering factors that many of us are living very stressful lives. Thankfully, we've also evolved ways of dealing with this, which is the second system, the one to allow you to contemplate, to evaluate, to simulate, to know that retaliation on the road is not, getting into an altercation is probably not a good thing. So you can rein in with reason these automatic thoughts and ways of thinking. And that's really where positive psychology tries to work. It can't really change these evolutionary embedded ways, but what we can do is try to bolster this more cognitive way of thinking about problems. Okay, so that's laid the ground rules, okay? So what are the things that we need to change? Well, this is where we get to the 7 lessons. Now, the first lesson is alter your ego. And this is after my heart, my research interests about the sense of self. I have been fascinated by the self for many decades now. And what do I mean by the self? Well, it's that conscious awareness of who we are, this sort of sense of, knowing and thinking, but also knowledge about our past. So it's a combination of our autobiographies as well as our stream of consciousness as we're having it. And we tend to think that ourselves don't change. But in fact, they do change quite significantly. But you're never aware of it. You don't wake up each day and think, oh, I'm different from yesterday. You experience continuity. But where we do see very obvious transitions in the self is in development. Because children, and anyone with children, will know how they change so radically. They've got personalities, but their sense of self definitely undergoes very significant transitions. The great Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget described the young infant as being egocentric. In other words, they can only conceive of everything from their own perspective. They cannot conceive of an external world. So they have this very distorted view. Now, to avoid problems with copyright, because I knew this was being broadcast, I decided to deploy the efforts of ChatGPT. So when I entered an egocentric child, this is what came up. And I think it kind of captures what I was trying to make, this sort of sense of the child being at the center of the nurturing universe and their parents all applauding them. And so the child sees themselves as dominant. But of course, that's all very well and fine when you're very young. But if you do not change that outlook as you start to interact with other children, then this is a real course or a real source of problems. Because children must learn to get on. They must learn to cooperate. They must learn to share. Sharing is something it takes quite a bit of time to do. And, childhoods are long because there's a whole set of rules that children must assimilate and learn to move by. Now, there's some interesting demonstrations of how egocentric children can be. This is a photograph by a colleague of mine. Don't be surprised if you want to play hide and seek and an egocentric child runs into the bathroom and then pulls the towel over their head. Why would they do something so peculiar? Clearly, their body is visible. Well, the reason is because they're so egocentric, they literally think that others see the world the same way they do. So they think, if I can't see you, well, it stands to reason you can't possibly see me. Or consider thoughts. If I show an egocentric child Oops, that's not going to work. If I show an egocentric child a box of Smarties, never work with inanimate objects, and ask them, what do you think's in here? The child will say Smarties. A 3-year-old kind of knows these are confectionery. If I then show them, in fact, it contains pencils, well, they think that's hilarious. They're really easy to amuse. But the point is, if I then ask the child, what did you think was in there when I first showed you it? The child will say, pencils, having conveniently forgotten a moment ago they were holding a false belief. That's kind of interesting, but if I then ask the child, imagine your friend Billy comes into the room, and I show him the tube, what will he say is in there? And the child says, oh, no confidence, pencils. Seemingly thinking that everybody shares the same knowledge states that they do. Again, this is egocentric thinking. Because in order to be able to cooperate and communicate and negotiate, you have to understand that other people have different views, different perspectives, and different thoughts about the world. So you need to work together. So we grow up out of this egocentric view of the world, this sort of sense that you're the most important person. Well, when I say we grow up, most of us grow up. Some of us retain a very egocentric view of the world. Some of us even become president. But my point is that we all vary along this dimension, okay? And it's all too easy, especially when we're stressed, to revert to our childhood ways of thinking. This is a theme I developed in an earlier book of mine. Because these things never go away. It takes effort to think less egocentrically. But unless you do this, then you're going to suffer from what Mark Leary calls the curse of self. Because when you are the center of your world, then you blow everything out of proportion. You think you're paramount, your problems are worse than everyone else's problems. And given the negativity bias I just told you about, you distort things. Much better to become more allocentric, where you see yourself connected with others. Because not only does that mean that you're more likely to get some support, because frankly, who wants to be friends with a narcissist? Maybe I should strike that. The point is, you can then benefit from the reciprocity of support. Moreover, you can see that other people have things going on in their lives which are way more important than your problems. So it gives you perspective, which is why one of the reasons why we argue we advise our students to write gratitude letters. A gratitude letter is a well-known positive intervention. It forces you to recognize that you're benefited by the help of people helping you, but also recognize that others less fortunate than you. So I think this helps to do that. Okay, so what are the lessons from this first chapter? Well, one of the things I do is teach you how to become less egocentric. And for this, we're going to use a little bit of audience participation, okay? So I want you, in the next moment, to think about a problem that you have. It could be a personal problem. I don't want a global problem like the war or climate change. Choose a problem which is relevant to you, personal to you, like it could be financial, it could be health, it could be relationships, it could be work problems. And we've all got them, okay? Because I want you to process that problem in the following way. I want you to talk about your problem. In a public forum not like this, I want you to use your internal voice. But if you're alone, you can do it out loud. But here, I'd like you to talk to yourself in the following way. I want you to discuss your problem, reflect upon it, using first-person language, I, me, and so on. So let's say it's an example. I am worried about my I'm worried about my pronunciation during the Royal Institution lecture because I think it makes me look foolish, and this upsets me. I want you now to do something similar about your own problem in your head. Just do it now for a moment. Now, if you have a real problem, how does that make you feel? Probably not too good. I've just reminded you of something that you weren't thinking about, made you acknowledge it's a problem, and recognize it's upsetting you. What a jerk I am. But I have a quick solution, okay? I want you to do the same thing again, but this time do not use any first-person terms like I or me. I want you to use your own name, and I want you to use non-first-person terms like he or she, him, her, whatever it is that you use, and review the problem. Going back to what I'm saying, Bruce is worried about his Royal Institution lectures because he's stumbling over his words, and this is upsetting him. I want you to do it with your own problem. Do it now. Okay. So in comparison, which did you find less distressing? Put your hand up if you thought talking about your problem using I was less distressing. Put your hand up if you thought talking about it in the third person was less distressing. It's almost invariable that when you do this, this seems to create a real psychological distance between yourself and your problem. And there are many ways you can do this in the chapter I talk about, but psychological distancing is a powerful way to disengage from the egocentric view and become allocentric. Because we always talk about ourselves in the first person, not unless we're royalty, and we say, we are not amused. But most of us use I, and therefore we immerse ourselves in the intensity of negative emotions. But when you are using non-first person terms, talking about Bruce, you can use it to amplify positive emotions and attenuate those negative ones. Because it's like you're talking to yourself as a friend. So there's a good example from lesson 1 about how you can become less egocentric and more allocentric. Okay, how are we doing for time? Yeah. All right. Number 2, avoid isolation. Now, this chapter really outlines something peculiar about our species. First of all, we have an unusual life strategy. We live for a very long period of time, but we also have the longest childhood of any animal, if you think about it. Why is that? Well, part of it is because we have these very large brains. Now, Robin DeMar has proposed what he calls the social brain hypothesis. When you look at the brains of mammals which live in groups of different complexity, those that live in the most complex social environments have larger brains. And we, by comparison, have the biggest brains, 7 times larger than you would imagine. Why? Well, according to ChatGPT, it's because we can live in these very intensively complex environments, okay? The problem with having a big brain is, well, it takes a long time to mature, childhood up to 18 years. But also delivering a big brain is really challenging. Childbirth is very particularly dangerous for our species. I think this is one of the reasons that I think we're fairly unique in the animal kingdom to have assisted deliveries. Chimpanzees can go off and have babies after a couple hours by themselves. Most humans require some form of assistance. Moreover, the period immediately after birth is also a vulnerable period because you have to raise a child. And in general, I would say that raising children requires coordinated, cooperative efforts. And I think that's been with us for quite a while. And this is why we've evolved all these emotions of attachment and love and so on. We are so codependent that you couldn't really exist if you were on your own. So that's why being excluded is such a painful experience. Ostracism is something which resonates painfully for all of us. And it begins early, because when the child's in their home environment, it's fine, but when they go into the environment where their peers start to become more important, then they become acutely sensitive to the possibility of being excluded. To the extent it registers in the same regions of the brain where pain registers. So in these studies, this is a magnetic resonance imaging study, they got patients to play a game, and they induced a sense of being ostracized by excluding the player, the patient. And what you find is that an area known as the anterior cingulate here lights up. This is the same area which lights up under pain. Pain, if you think about it, is nature's way of warning you, you've got to do something to change your behavior, take your hand out of the fire and so on. In the same way, social exclusion or social pain tells you you need to do something to change your circumstances. Not only is isolation problematic when you're young, it's really problematic as you get older, and this is an increasing problem of loneliness. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read all of this, but this is a meta-analysis, which is a study of all the studies looking at the morbidity risks for various factors. And here we have, famously, social relationships have a greater morbidity risk than more familiar ones, such as smoking 15 cigarettes a day and alcohol consumption, lack of exercise, and obesity. So being left alone is not just mentally distressing, it's physically distressing as well. So this is the lesson: avoid loneliness. Lesson number 3, reject negative comparisons. I mean, in many ways, this is how the brain experiences life. It's always making comparisons. Every sensation, every experience you have is a comparison. You're a comparison engine, Your brain is always drawing these comparisons. So food tastes saltier if you've just been eating something sweet. Something is louder if you've come in from a quiet room, and so on. And this shows up in perception. This is a famous Ebbinghaus illusion. The two circles look different. The two circles, orange circles, look different, but in fact, they're exactly the same. But because the brain is comparing them to the context, one circle seems smaller. But if you remove the contexts, you can see, in fact, they are identical. Now, we are the same, okay? How we think about our status and how we're getting on is relative to what everyone else is doing. So we, too, are subject to the biases of context. If you take them away, our brains are the same. Now, this produces some interesting sort of distortions. With the Olympics coming up, I want you to look out at the television the next time you get an opportunity. Because if you look at the finalist podium, there's usually one person who is unhappy, and it's not the person who came last in the lineup. So here we have, I think it's from 2016. There's two very, very happy people here, and one Frenchman who is not very happy at all. If you look at the emotional expressions, it's typically the silver medalist who's the least happy. Now, why is that? Well, because he's comparing himself to the gold medalist. He's going to go down the record books. The silver medalist is thinking, if I just tried a bit harder, I would have got it, damn it. The bronze medalist, on the other hand, he's not comparing himself to the gold medalist or silver medalist. He's comparing himself to every schmuck who didn't even get onto the podium. So he's going, hey, I got a medal. Okay. Now, I think we all do this to a greater or lesser extent. Some of us are really socially oriented, to use the technical term. I think I'm a good-looking, charismatic, successful professor, until I compare myself with Brad Pitt and maybe Barack Obama or maybe Elon Musk. My point is, there's always someone on any dimension of your personality, whatever you think, is doing better than you. Although I would imagine if we ever had the opportunity, and this maybe the R I should think about, if you invite one of these guys here and get them to be honest, we could all identify aspects of our lives where we feel inadequate compared to someone else. But that's not the way we think, because social media presents this endless evidence of everyone having a much better life than ourselves. In fact, it encourages us to post our best parties, our best dresses, our best friends, whatever. Everyone's doing so well because we're seeking validation, which is why ostracism works as well, because we're so fearful of missing out. We need to have all the support, but then we compare and despair. I think that's the real problem with social media. It's this tendency to produce a distortion of reality, and therefore we feel inadequate. Before I move on, there is one situation where both the silver medalist and the bronze medalist can feel inadequate, especially if they're boys competing in a wrestling competition. As you can see, they've been beaten. Okay. Lesson number 4, become more optimistic. This is really challenging. As I said earlier on, we have a brain which has this design feature to pay attention to negative things. They impact on us more. We pay more attention to it. If people are reading the newspaper, we know that their eyes are looking at the negative information. They're remembering it more. So we have this real difficulty of being balanced because we're seeking it out. Bad is stronger than good. And yet, some people do seem to have a disposition which is more positive. Now, what is it about optimists and pessimists? Well, first of all, optimists are more willing to try. They don't give up as easy. Pessimists say, what's the point? It's never going to work. The optimists then end up being more productive because people like to be around positive people. They don't like to be around people who don't sort of, try. They end up being happier and healthier. The same sort of morbidity studies show, one recent study in 2019, again, very large study over 25 years, show that optimists live on average 8 to 10 years longer than the most pessimistic people in that study. So there is a real benefit to being optimistic. But how do you become more optimistic? Well, this is the work of Marty Seligman, and he's one of the 4 founding fathers of the positive psychology movement. He and his colleagues looked at optimism and pessimism, and they discovered there are different ways in which the two groups interpret events. Remember, epictetus, it's not what happens, it's what you make of it. And they identify 3 dimensions: permanence, pervasiveness, and personal, taking things personally. So imagine you're a student and you fail a term paper. The optimists and pessimists would differ in the way they make sense of it. The pessimist would take that example, say, I'm never going to be able to pass exams, okay? This is a failure, I'm never going to be able to change. The optimist will say, will draw a line under it and say, oh, all right, I'll do better next time. In terms of pervasiveness, the pessimist is likely to extrapolate and say, I failed this exam, I'm a failure at everything I do in life, okay? Whereas the optimist is much more likely to curtail it or silo it and say, okay, that's one exam, but I've got other things going on in my life that are going well. And in terms of responsibility, the pessimist is likely to internalize it with an internal locus of control. It's my fault. I'm the one responsible for failure. Whereas the optimist is more likely to deflect. Maybe it's that Professor Hood. He thinks he's a great lecturer. But, I don't think he's really a good teacher, It's his problem, not mine. And so clearly, you've got to find a balance, because if you don't recognize your responsibility in any of these situations, you're never going to change, are you? So you've got to recognize that you need to take some responsibility. You need to find a balance. But if you're going to strike the balance, try and become more optimistic because of all the benefits. How do you do that? Well, what we recommend is a Seligman's ABCDE technique. And if you're thinking about doing this, I would advise you to invest in a good journal or diary and a pen or a good pencil. Don't do it digitally. You don't process thoughts as well when you do it on a computer. When you're writing it down, the effort it takes to do it actually makes it process more deeply. And what you do in this technique it comes in two stages. ABC. ABC is take an event that has upset you and articulate in as much detail the nature of the adversity, what you believe happened, and the consequences. So let's say, this is tomorrow. I was giving this lecture, the Royal Institution Discourse, and I tried to do a demonstration, and the box fell apart, and it was awful. Everyone was laughing at me, and oh my God, what a fool I must have looked. That's my belief. What are the consequences? I'll never be invited back to the RI again. No one will buy my book. All right? And the point is, you articulate in as much detail the nature of the problem, because you need as much evidence and detail in order to dispute it. This is what you do in the second half. In the second half, you step out of yourself. You become, I like to say, a defense lawyer. You are now defending the client. And you take every example and piece of evidence that you've just written down and you challenge it, because you can always find an alternative, more positive way of thinking about anything, okay? I said, oh, yeah, well, okay, but people were laughing. Do you remember that? And you did sell some books. And so, you can imagine how you can take anything, and you can always find a more positive spin on everything. And having just gone through that process, you can then recognize that something that was upsetting you only half an hour earlier, you've now actually realized was not so bad, and this should energize you. It should give you confidence to go out and try it again, and maybe prepare and get a better set of props next time rather than rubbish tubes of Smarties. Okay, so that's the ABC technique, but don't be delusional, okay? You've got to recognize there's a reality to pay attention to. Okay, lesson number 5, control your attention. So we should be about 40 minutes into the talk. Yeah, about right. Which means that a lot of you are not paying attention. Actually, I never really talk longer than 40 minutes because I know that's the limit for the attention span. Thank you, Royal Institution Discourse Lecture. But anyway, I am not disappointed, because mind wandering is happening right now in a lot of you, if not most of you, because it's difficult. I'm talking quite fast. I'm giving you lots of information. Your brain is the most metabolically hungry organ in the body. It's effortful listening to someone. But we tend to just mind wander all the time. Now, you might think mind wandering, control your attention is this lesson, by the way. You might think mind wandering is pleasant, a bit of daydreaming. Oh, I wonder what I'm going to do after this. Oh, I might do this. That might be fun. But in fact, a lot of mind wandering is negative rumination. It's worrying about things. And we know this from the work of Killingsworth and my friend Dan Gilbert. They did this really innovative study with smartphones. They got people, gave them an app, and this app would notify them at various points of the day randomly and ask them 3 questions. What are you doing right now? Are you thinking about what you're doing? And by the way, how happy are you? All right? And what they found was astounding. And actually, we've just replicated this in our student population as well, so I'm quite sure this is robust. It turns out mind wandering happens 50% of the waking hours. Half of the time, we're not thinking about what we're doing, which is a little worrying if you're driving a car or flying a plane. Thank God for autopilot. That's all I can say. And in a third of all activities, with one exception, which is sex, and which is not too surprising, because if there's one occasion where you really should be concentrating, it's during an intimate act like that, okay? But what was really interesting is that, yeah, we have positive moments of thinking about the upcoming Glastonbury or whatever we're going to do. We're excited about that. But when our thoughts are neutral or negative, and you measure the happiness, it's much worse than even the positive events. So this is why the paper was entitled, "The Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." What can you do about it? Well, paradoxically, I need to remind you of this. What's going on in the brain here, and this is really fascinating, it turns out that when you're not on task and your mind is wandering, then there's a series of systems in the brain which fire into action. They're called the default mode network. And I just want to take a moment to tell you, this was discovered by chance by some of the early pioneers looking at fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. This is where you can measure blood flow. And in these early studies, in order to kind of measure what's going on when you're looking at visual targets or hearing words, is you had to have a baseline measure. So the early researchers said, okay, just lie there and don't think of anything. We just need your baseline measures. And what they thought would happen is that you get flattened brain activation. In fact, they found the opposite. When you're told not to think of anything, just lie there, the default mode network kicks into action. And this network, we now know, is representation of self and others. And what we think is going on is it's running simulations. I wish I hadn't said that, and what's going to happen, and oh God, what's happening tomorrow. So you're doing this housework, this housekeeping in your brain, looking at all these potential things. So the default mode network is the basis for mind wandering, and it's associated with negative thinking. So what can you do? Well, interestingly, the way to stop mind wandering is actually to clear your mind. Meditation is known to be very effective in reducing mind wandering. So again, imaging studies, this is Brewster's work, the green, the red, and the blue are different forms of meditation. And what they did is they looked at meditators defined as those who were experts with at least 10,000 hours or so. And the controls were others who had just been taught the techniques. So they didn't have a lot of experience in it. And then they put them in the scanner and said, okay, just free your minds, don't think of anything. And what you can see is that in the meditators, their bold signals, the blood oxygenation levels, drop. So they're becoming deactivated. Whereas in the novices, it starts to rise, which is the signal for the default mode network. Same for the prefrontal and the more anterior areas. So this is confirmation that meditation seems to attenuate the default mode network, which is normally associated with being unhappy. So what's going on? Well, all meditations, depending on what forms they are, kind of share a similar mechanism of switching your attentional spotlight from the internal dialogue, the internal little critic in your head, this little voice which is saying, you're useless, Bruce, why do you bother? And switching it towards your sensations, pay attention to your breathing, think about this, and basically trying to draw your attention away from the internal dialogue in your head. Because you can't simultaneously attend to your thoughts and your bodily sensations like breathing or distant sounds, because attention operates a little bit like a spotlight. A spotlight can be intense. You can focus the beam, and that will amplify the experience. So if you're enjoying pleasure, focus your attention on it, and it'll be even more pleasurable. You can focus your attention on pain, and it makes it more painful. Or you can have diffuse attention. But the point is, attention cannot be split easily. And if you're not attending to something, you won't notice it. In fact, attention and consciousness are interdependent in many ways. And this gives me an opportunity to demonstrate. I'm so grateful I got this wonderful demonstration from Michael Cohen at Amherst University. He sent it to me. I knew about it, but I asked him. He said you could show it. Because what I'm going to show you now is a sequence. This is actually a movie, because as you're looking at this movie, it's changing right in front of your very eyes. So there we have our famous little spiral in the middle there, so that's what you saw before. But as you're looking at this, because your attention is kind of spread and diffuse, you're not noticing that it's changing right in front of your very eyes. In fact, it's almost a completely different thing. Now, some of you may have spotted something, but my expectation that most of you have not spotted anything. So put your hands up if you've not spotted anything. Okay, that's the majority. Let me show you what the first slide was. Here we go. That's the first slide. And that's the end of the film, okay? So, oops, there we go. That's the end of the film. That's the first slide. But because the change, remember I said the brain is a comparison engine? Those changes are so subtle. If you don't know, you won't see them. They don't enter into consciousness. So that's the mechanism behind attention. Oops, now where are we going next? So you might think, okay, how many of us have lain in bed at night and say, stop thinking about this? You know, last night I was like, don't think about the lecture tomorrow. Just stop doing that. Because, you know, it's this intrusive thought. That's the worst thing you can do, okay? And I'm going to use another demonstration here. We're doing 50 minutes. Okay, I can work it out. Okay, for the next minute, you can think about anything you like. Anything. But the one thing you can't think about, you're not allowed to think about, is a white bear. So we're going to start, watch the clock go now. If it pops into your head, be honest, put your hand up. So think about anything, but not the white bear. Go. Okay. All right, the hand's all right. It usually takes a little bit longer than that. I think your guys' attention span, all right, some of you are managing it. It's really tough. And this is what Dostoevsky pointed out. He wrote back in the 19th century that pose yourself this task, the one thing you can't stop yourself doing is ignoring a thought. You can't do it. And the reason is down to my late colleague Dan Wegner pointed out, it's called ironic thought suppression. It's ironic because the very thing you don't want to think about becomes the most prominent thing in your mind. The reason is because of attention, okay? Because you're trying to stop yourself thinking it, okay? I can't think of this bear. Paradoxically, you're making that the strongest representation in your mind, okay? And also, you're monitoring your stream of thought to see if it's popped into your head or go. So how do you deal with it? Well, you can distract yourself. Remember, attention cannot be split. And that, I think, is in many ways why gaming has become so popular when people are, because the games are designed to attack your attention or pull your attention in. The trouble is, it doesn't really help the unresolved problem. So I would suggest that you could possibly do the postpone it and then process it at a later date. I'm a big fan of keeping a journal because I think it allows you to process things, but also gives you tangible evidence that the problem which was paramount last year has gone away. And we seem to forget how much easily the problems which we thought we could never get over actually do disappear. So I think processing thoughts, writing them down is very valuable. Or you could try meditation, because one of the things you're taught is if a thought comes into your head, just acknowledge it and let it float out the window like a cloud. Don't give it any emphasis. Okay. So that's lesson number 5. Lesson number 6. Now, this really does cycle back to what I was saying about lesson number 2, the fact we're such a social animal. The irony is that we now live in incredibly dense societies where there's lots of opportunities to form these connections, and it's the one thing we don't want to do, okay? If you travel on the tube, you'll see that everyone is staring at their phones. And actually, people actively avoid interacting because we think it's just going to be so awful and awkward, and we don't like having to strike up conversations. So Nick Epley did this study in Chicago and London, and he chose London specifically because people said this is the last thing, I couldn't imagine anything worse than speaking to someone else in public transport. Seriously, and actually, I'll come back to an anecdote in a moment. But he did this study where he got commuters and he paid them and then he measured their happiness, and then they were given one envelope which had one of 3 instructions. They were told to commute out that day and sit in solitude, or to strike up a conversation with a stranger, or to do what they normally do, which was the control. And then they went out and did their commute, and they were called up later in the day. They also got a second group of commuters who were asked to predict. How do you think that would be? Okay, what do you think, how positive do you think that experience would be? So here's the data. And what you can see shown here is the data for the trains and the buses. These are the predictions. So the white square is solitude, and that's going up from the scale. So it's saying that would be best, that would be the most positive. And the least positive, in other words, negative, would be forming a connection. What did the people who actually had to do these instructions report? Well, you probably guessed it, entirely the opposite pattern. People forced to strike up a conversation actually enjoy it more than being forced to sit in solitude. And this is what's called pluralistic ignorance. In other words, everyone thinks it'll be so awkward to kind of strike up a conversation that no one does it, okay? And interesting, the people who are talked to, you might think, oh God, they're going to move away from me. they actually enjoy being talked to as well. And that anecdote I was going to refer to is that when I think it was an American journalist, heard about this research, he actually tried a campaign on the tubes saying, strike up a conversation with me. And this Londoner had a counter campaign. I can't remember exactly the wording, but like hell you will. I'd rather drink acid. So anyway, so people just think this will be so awful, but in fact it is generally good. So do strike up a conversation. Okay. Lesson number 7, get out of your own head. What did ChatGPT come up for that image? Well, not surprisingly, something psychedelic. Now, that is kind of relevant because in the book I do talk about this recent development in clinical research in clinical assisted therapies, psychedelic clinically assisted therapy. Because it's going on here in London. I think at King's and Imperial, there's researchers on this, and in America. Obviously, it's under restraint because these are illegal drugs, but psilocybin, in addition to its obviously euphoria and vivid hallucinations, has been proven to actually impact on those with intractable depression, with remarkable findings. There's not a large number of studies, but enough to get people really excited about it. And it just takes one session. And months later, these people are still good. And the reason is, well, the one lasting legacy of this experience they report is they feel that their sense of self has been changed. They feel a greater connection with humanity and the environment and the cosmos. So I think it's also, maybe it is a coincidence, but psilocybin works on the serotonin system, which, guess what, is the mechanism for the default mode network. So maybe what we're seeing is an alteration of representation of self and others. Now, look, I'm not advocating that people should do this because actually it can be dangerous if you have certain dispositions. That's why it should be done under clinical supervision. But there are other ways to alter your sense of self. And this has been a feature of many civilizations and rituals, and they don't all have to be religious. Some of them are secular. But here is a religious ceremony. These are the famous whirling dervishes of Turkey. These are the Sufis. And I did not know this, but I have subsequently discovered that this dance is a symbolic death of the ego. The hat, this bizarre hat on the head, is supposed to be the tombstone of the ego, and the skirt is this shroud. And they whirl around like this, constantly into a trance state, and they have this dissolution of self, this annihilation of the sense of self. Buddhists, anatta, Buddhism advocates the annihilation of self because of all the associated problems with it. Join a choir. Choirs are really great. People's sense of self, they feel more connected. As the harmony of the rises of the sound, people have this emotional experience, which isn't just a musical experience, it's an emotional experience. Or if you're very lucky, take a trip out into space. One of the most common reports of astronauts, and I believe Kevin Fong has certainly talked to them, is the so-called overview effect. When you go out into outer space and look back at the planet, they typically report an unexpected, profound sense of humanity and connection, and seeing that the problems that they have down on Earth are inconsequential in comparison to the vastness of the universe and the beauty of the planet. And this is called the overview effect. And I think that this report resonates with what Carl Sagan talked about. And I was speaking to someone earlier, and I said, I will be mentioning some about physics. And this is the famous blue dot, the small pale blue dot. And in it, you can see a pale little dot caught in a sunbeam. And Sagan, and I've kind of paraphrased it, he wrote, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilizations, every king and peasant, every corrupt politician, God, there's lots of them, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of the species lived there on a remote mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. And this is the image of Voyager as it's leaving our galaxy. And some people might think, oh God, that sounds terribly humbling. I just think it's beautiful, and I think it captures, this sense that we've got to see the connectedness of ourselves and enjoy the fragility of life and the brief moments that we have. Okay. Or you could go detecting. this is me, and yes, I am a nerdy detectorist. This is me out with my metal detector in the fields in Somerset. And you might think, oh my God, you must be mind wandering all the time. No, I'm wandering around the fields. And yeah, my mind does wander, but the beauty of metal detecting is it's a bit like fishing on land, okay? You're doing this, and you beep, beep. Oh gosh, that's treasure. And then you get down into doing. So you're constantly being interrupted with your thought processes, and I find this incredibly soothing. In fact, there's a Danish study showing that metal detecting has been therapeutic for people with PTSD. And I can totally understand why. It's a totally absorbing holiday. So how do you achieve happiness? Okay, I've taken you through the 7 lessons, and let me just kind of summarize what I'm going to say. It's really about recognizing that there are different forms of happiness. You can have hedonism. You know, we're going to be seeing a lot of that in the next couple of days at Glastonbury, and I know some people are going there. You know, spotted you guys. And that will be an opportunity to have intense emotional experiences, and that's all very well and fine. But it's very fleeting, okay? This is Aristippus. Aristotle, he was a much more sort of a bookie type of person. He said, no, flourishing, eudaimonia, this is where you should be doing. You should be enriching the lives of others. You should be leading a morally good life. And this will convey back upon you all the benefits of making other people happy. I think it can be both, okay? I think there's something to making yourself happy, but there's also something to be said for making others happy. It's getting the balance right. If you are so self-centered, then others must suffer as a consequence. There's a limit, okay? But if you are so other-focused, there's a danger of becoming overly empathic to their problems and losing your own sense of purpose and self-respect. So you've got to find this balance. And that, I think, is the secret to happiness. And again, ChatGPT, and now you can see the failures of AI. It can't spell selfish. When I said write selfish, it had some weird thing, and it doesn't even connect up properly, so I'm not worried about my job's about to be taken away. But this is the balance that we should seek, okay? Now, I just want to point out something that maybe you hadn't appreciated, and something I've discovered as I've been teaching this for 6 years, that the happiness that you derive from your own pleasure, as it were, is inauthentic. You could do retail therapy. You could decide, I'm going to go out and treat myself today. But the trouble is that level of joy and happiness doesn't last very long. It's inauthentic. Because if you are the instigator, purveyor, and recipient of happiness, it's never a surprise. You know when you're bored of it, and then you move on. On the other hand, if you direct your efforts to making lots of other people happy, it's authentic because they're not expecting it, and you don't know how they're receiving it, but you can imagine that they're having a great time, and you never know when they're tired of your efforts. And you know what? After my course is over, I often have students writing to me to express, I think, really profound sentiments about how this course has changed them. And I think this is part of the issue, that when you force yourselves to try and be more allocentric, there are unforeseen consequences which are generally really positive. And that's the beauty of it. I'm always continually surprised by the little gestures and the messages of love, for want of a better word, that I'm receiving from my students. And nothing can be more gratifying than that. Last year, I was out with my metal detector. And it was on my birthday, which made it more auspicious. And I discovered this Roman coin, which is probably not surprising because I live very close to Bath. And then I looked and discovered that it was none other than Marcus Aurelius. Now, those of you who enjoyed Gladiator, he was the one played by Richard Harris. Marcus Aurelius was the last of the 5 great emperors, okay? And he was a Stoic philosopher as well. Famously, he used to be followed around by an assistant. And if anyone should bow to him or subdue to him, the assistant had to whisper into the emperor's ear, "You're just the man. You're just the man." And as for happiness, he said, look, the happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. And I held that coin in my hand in that field in Somerset, and I looked at it, and I thought, what a lucky guy I am. And these are the teams I work with, okay? I can't take all the credit. This is the team who deliver the science of happiness at the University of Bristol, and I'm truly blessed to be working with such an amazing team. And I know I'm 30 seconds too short, but that's my hour for you.